Hello, and welcome back to Relax History. Tonight, we drift far back in time, to the golden sands and whispering winds of ancient Egypt, a place where pharaohs were worshipped like gods, and where the laws were just as strange as the legends. Did you know there were rules about shadows, and even about how to stand in front of a king? These odd and forgotten laws shaped daily life in ways we rarely hear about, quiet rules that kept power hidden in plain sight. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's explore them slowly, like walking barefoot through warm desert, stone. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from tonight? Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's begin. In the blistering light of ancient Egypt, where the sun was both worshipped and feared, the pharaoh was seen not merely as a ruler, but as a living god. Sacred, uninterrupted, was not to be touched by ordinary mortals. This belief gave rise to one of the strangest and least spoken of customs in history. No one was allowed to let their shadow fall upon the pharaoh. There are no formal legal scrolls that spell out this rule in writing. Instead, it lived in the rituals, traditions, and whispers of those who served the royal court. In tomb illustrations and temple carvings from the Old Kingdom period, circa 2500 BCE, we see processions arranged carefully, with attendants crouched low and guards forming wide circles around the pharaoh. The goal wasn't just to protect him physically, it was to protect the space around him from human contamination. Even a shadow was too close. The pharaoh's body was seen as a vessel of the gods. To allow a shadow to touch him was to interrupt divine energy, to dim the light of Ra himself. It was considered both dangerous and disrespectful. Some records even describe temple rituals where guards or servants were ritually cleansed or punished for allowing their silhouettes to fall too near the royal path. The offense wasn't physical, it was symbolic. They knew where the light would fall at every hour of the day, and the layout of every courtyard, balcony, and colonnade. Royal architects likely designed spaces to prevent accidental shadowing, pillars spaced wide, platforms elevated, throne rooms built with skylights and measured angles. Even light was arranged to honor power. What's more, commoners were forbidden to look directly at the pharaoh unless commanded to. To combine that with the accidental casting of a shadow, that was considered a dangerous spiritual insult. It's not known how often this law was broken, but it's clear no one dared test it often. So much effort, it seems, was spent protecting not just the body of the king, but the very space around him. A bubble of light, a zone of reverence, a boundary no one could see, but all knew existed. But what does it say about a kingdom when its ruler must be kept untouched by even the faintest trace of his people? Was this divine or calculated fear, cast long before any shadow ever could be? It wasn't just superstition that enforced the invisible barrier around the pharaoh. It was a system, a quiet, relentless, daily choreography that surrounded Egypt's divine ruler wherever he went. Priests, guards, architects, and even servants played their part in upholding the circle of light. To touch the pharaoh's body was unthinkable, but to touch his sunlight, that required coordination, planning, and fear. In temple ceremonies, the pharaoh entered not through shadows, but shafts of sunlight carefully engineered into the stone. Ancient Egyptian temples, such as those at Karnak and Abu Simbel, were aligned with the sun's movement. The pharaoh's path through these temples was timed so that the morning light would strike his crown or shoulders. This was no accident. Builders, astrologers, and priests worked together to ensure the ruler was always bathed in divine glow. temple guards were instructed to watch both the sun and the people. As the day moved, they shifted their positions, maintaining distance between others and the pharaoh's light path. Court officials and visiting dignitaries were often made to wait in shaded galleries or colonnades, where their presence wouldn't interfere with the natural spotlight of the king. Even in more relaxed settings, gardens, balconies, palaces, the boundaries were honored. Some scholars believe that servants were trained to kneel or crawl when passing behind the pharaoh during daytime, simply to avoid letting their shadow stretch forward into his path. These movements were not written down, they were passed orally, enforced through quiet correction and watchful eyes. Step out of line, and your entire family might be barred from royal service for generations. Curiously, this same reverence for shadow shows up in funerary art. The tomb of Seti I includes depictions of shadow demons and protective spells intended to keep the king's afterlife free from dark touches, even in death. The pharaoh's soul was to be surrounded by light. It's possible that this fear of shadows served a dual purpose: spiritual protection and social separation. If a farmer in the marketplace believed his shadow could offend the gods by brushing the pharaoh's feet, would he ever dare speak out against him? It's an old strategy: create invisible laws no one can challenge because no one fully understands them. And yet, in all this silence, in all this light, was the pharaoh truly safe, or merely surrounded by the illusion of sacredness, built stone by stone, rule by rule, by people too afraid to ever draw near? In ancient Egypt, a bed was not just a place to rest, it was a symbol of order, loyalty, and rank within the royal household, where hundreds of servants, attendants, concubines, and advisors moved through quiet halls and fragrant courtyards. Even sleep was governed by law. And at the very top of this hierarchy stood the most sacred bed in the land: the pharaohs. Pharaohs did not sleep like ordinary men. Their beds were often carved from cedar or ebony, inlaid with ivory or gold, and elevated from the floor on legs shaped like lion paws or bull hooves. But what truly set the pharaoh's bed apart was not its design, it was its untouchability. According to surviving records from palace protocol scrolls and fragments of instruction literature used to train royal attendants, no one was permitted to lie on, lean against, or even brush against the pharaoh's bed unless granted direct permission. It was seen as an extension of his divine authority. His resting body was considered in communion with the gods during the night. Concubines, yes, were sometimes brought to the pharaoh's chambers, but they too had limits. They were assigned to specific nights, sometimes based on astrological calendars and fertility rituals. They could not remain in the bed without command, nor sleep past dawn. Once dismissed, they were required to leave silently and report to their own quarters. To linger was to violate order. Even in broader palace quarters, sleeping arrangements followed rigid assignments. Servants had designated sleeping mats based on their role and proximity to the royal chambers. Some were not permitted to lie down until the pharaoh was asleep. Others had to sleep in shifts, staying alert in case their master stirred. There were even records of penalties for a servant found sleeping in the wrong corner of the palace during festivals or processions in Pharaoh temples. The pharaoh's traveling bed was carried with reverence, set up in private tents where guards stood watch, not just over the king, but over the air around him. It was said that the bed retained divine energy and should not be used by anyone else, not even in his absence. So rigid were these rules that in one surviving tale from the Ramesside period, A scribe was stripped of his position, not for theft, not for disrespect, but because he rested briefly on a platform once used to prepare the king's sleeping chamber. He hadn't even touched the bed itself. What does it say about a world where your social rank determined not only your work, your food, or your name, but also where and how you were allowed to sleep? The pharaoh's bed was more than a place of rest. It was a protected boundary, and in ancient Egypt, crossing that boundary, even by accident, could carry severe consequences. The idea was not just that the pharaoh was divine, but that every object he touched, especially where he slept, held traces of sacred energy. To lie in those same sheets without permission wasn't simply seen as disrespect. It was an act of ritual violation. While no formal courtroom documents exist spelling out this law in clear legal terms, punishment for bed-related offenses can be found in scattered temple warnings, stories passed down by priests, and administrative records. One such reference appears in the instructions of Ani, a wisdom text that warned servants never to let the body lie where the king has lain, lest your fate be cut off by your own dream. The message was simple: sleep in the wrong place, and your very spirit could be in danger. Among the royal staff, fear of such mistakes shaped their every movement. Chamber attendants were required to maintain a precise record of where the pharaoh had rested, even temporarily. Special incense was burned to cleanse couches and cushions once the king had risen. And in some royal estates, a secondary set of linens was burned rather than reused. Even after the king's passing, some beds were buried with him or sealed in private tomb chambers, never to be touched again. Punishments for breaking these taboos varied. A commoner who found their way into a restricted palace space might be fined, exiled, or in rare cases executed if judged to have defiled something sacred. In one obscure account from the reign of Thutmose III, a junior guard fell asleep near the entrance of the pharaoh's personal quarters after a long shift. He was found lying against the outer post of the chamber, not even in the room itself. Still, he was dismissed, beaten, and denied access to state employment ever again. Interestingly, even among pharaohs, such rules were upheld. After the mysterious death of Akhenaten, his successor Tutankhamun refused to sleep in his predecessor's bedchamber, having it sealed and repurposed as a shrine. The bed itself became untouchable, not for comfort or taste, but for fear of spiritual impurity. These laws didn't just control where people slept. They controlled what was considered holy in everyday life. The idea that one could commit a crime by laying on the wrong cushion, by closing one's eyes in the wrong corner of a palace, these were the invisible levers of power that kept society tightly wound. So next time you stretch out in your own bed without a second thought, consider, what would it feel like to live in a world where even sleep could be a punishable offense? In the shadowed corners of ancient Egyptian temples, where incense curled through the air and jackal-headed gods watched from painted walls, mourning was not a wild, uncontrollable expression of grief. It was a regulated performance, shaped by law and order, just like everything else in the land of the pharaohs. The Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a sacred transition. And because death was holy, the mourning process had to follow strict spiritual guidelines. Loud cries, tearing of clothes, or public displays of sorrow were only permitted under certain conditions, and only by certain people. If done improperly, or without permission, mourning could be seen not just as disruptive, but illegal. Temple scrolls from the Middle Kingdom period describe a practice called silent grief. This wasn't just personal stoicism, it was law. In some regions, Especially during periods of national mourning or major temple ceremonies, families were forbidden from weeping aloud in public. Crying too loudly near a sacred procession, especially if it interrupted priests or rituals, could lead to fines or even public lashings. Professional mourners, usually women trained to perform ritual wails at funerals, were only allowed to grieve during approved hours. Their roles were highly respected, but carefully controlled. They had to register with temple officials, wear specific clothing, and follow designated chants passed down from priestesses of Isis and Hathor. An unauthorized mourner caught crying in a funeral line could be removed, fined, or forbidden from working again. One story, found in a fragment from the tomb of a noble named Irianekti, describes a young servant who wailed too soon at his master's funeral. He had entered the hall before the time of lament had officially begun. For his premature grief, he was flogged and banished from the estate. His crime, breaking the silence before the gods had spoken. Even within homes, laws governed the timing and manner of grief. Some districts required families to remain quiet during embalming days, allowing noise only after the body was sealed in the tomb. Neighbors were told to report any disturbances. This was not cruelty, was control, based on the belief that unrestrained sorrow could anger the spirits of the dead or distract their journey to the afterlife. Yet, despite the rules, the Egyptians found quiet ways to mourn. Some wrote grief poems on scraps of linen tucked into burial wrappings. Others lit perfumed oils in private rooms, offering their sorrow to the gods in silence. It was a culture that grieved deeply, but always by the book. In a time when even tears could be taxed or timed, mourning became an art of restraint, a whisper of love instead of a shout of loss, a silent room, heavy with everything left unsaid. In ancient Egypt, a funeral wasn't just a personal event, it was a state-approved ritual, with its own procedures, timing, and legal boundaries. And if those boundaries were crossed, mourners could find themselves fined, barred from the tomb, or even punished for disrespecting the journey of the dead. Much like modern permits for public gatherings, Egyptians required funerals to follow strictly outlined formats, especially in larger cities like Memphis or Thebes. Public tombs and temple burial chambers were overseen by priests who acted almost like civil inspectors. If a family hired to, many mourners used banned incense or began the rites outside the approved time window. The priesthood had the authority to stop the funeral completely. In some cases, the body would be confiscated and held until a fine was paid. One clay document from the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III refers to a widow who was penalized 10 silver deben because her grief singers arrived early, disrupting a purification rite in the temple court. The priests wrote that her sorrow overflowed before the jars were washed, and this was not proper before the gods. The law also monitored the tone of mourning. Wailing was permitted, but only in specific songs passed down from temple scrolls. Improvised crying, accusations toward the gods, or vocal protests about the death itself could be seen as blasphemy. If someone shouted, "This death is unfair," during the procession, it could be recorded as an offense against Matha, divine principle of balance. And then there were the silent funerals, mandated in times of plague or famine. During such events, temple edicts banned public mourning altogether. Corpses had to be buried quietly, with minimal ceremony, to avoid spreading emotional contamination. A decree from the 18th dynasty stated, "Let no loud sorrow rise in the streets. Let the tomb be sealed without drums. The gods weep in silence, and so shall you." The punishments for breaking these silence laws varied. Nobles might face temple exile or fines. Commoners could be whipped or shamed publicly. The harshest known case involved a man who interrupted a burial by crying out that the soul of the dead should return and curse the priest. For this outburst, he was sentenced to 7 years of temple servitude, forced to live as a cleaner in the lowest halls of the necropolis. Yet beneath all these rules, the core belief remained. Grief was powerful, even dangerous. Left unchecked, it might disturb the soul's journey, offend the gods, or unsettle the living. So the state managed sorrow like it managed everything else with order, structure, and law. In ancient Egypt, even your final goodbye had to be whispered, or risk being silenced altogether. As the golden sun dipped beneath the Nile, and shadows stretched over the mud-brick streets of ancient cities like Abydos and Heliopolis, a strange hush would descend not from nature, but from law, for merchants, artisans, and stall-keepers. Nightfall wasn't just an end to business, it was a legal boundary, a curtain pulled down by decree. The Pharaoh had spoken, let the market sleep. Ancient Egyptian commerce was vibrant, and essential open-air stalls offered onions and bread, beads and incense, sandals and scrolls. But with prosperity came temptation, smuggling, cheating under low torchlight, stolen goods passed hand to hand in the dark. So pharaohs, especially during the Middle Kingdom, issued curfews for commercial activity. And these weren't just suggestions, they were punishable rules carved into temple walls and city tablets. City records from the time of Setniasret to mention a market law titled simply, the sealing of the weighing stones after sunset. This meant that all official trade scales, used to weigh bread loaves, copper rings, and sacks of grain, had to be locked and sealed by a temple scribe before dusk. Trading after this time, even among neighbors, was considered shadow commerce, and violators could be fined or flogged. But the curfew went deeper than just selling. By the 6th hour of the afternoon, all vendor stalls had to be packed. Reed mats were tied up, oil lamps snuffed. The shopkeeper's name was recorded by a street guard known as a moon watcher. If, on patrol, the moon watcher found you still, haggling or displaying wares, you were marked for punishment at dawn. And it wasn't just goods, it was gatherings. Merchants caught lingering outside shops in groups were accused of night collusion, and their stall permits could be revoked for a season. The law believed that only thieves, drunks, or schemers conducted trade by torchlight. There were exceptions, of course. During religious festivals or funerary weeks, special licenses were granted for moon market activities. These were tightly regulated and taxed double. Sometimes, priests themselves operated these twilight booths, selling amulets, herbs, and temple wine under sacred supervision. But for most traders, the night was forbidden space. The risk wasn't worth it. And so, just as the pharaoh rested in his golden chamber, the shopkeeper rested on a straw mat beside shuttered wood and knotted rope, listening to the quiet rustle of papyrus trees and the gentle gurgle of distant canals. The law made sure the city slept, not just its people, but its coins, its onions, and its jars of perfumed oil. In a world ruled by ritual and rhythm, even commerce had a bedtime. But rules, no matter how strictly carved in stone, always met the quiet defiance of human need. And so, beneath the curfews of Pharaoh's cities, a hidden life stirred moonlight markets, where shadows became stalls and whispers replaced the cries of daytime trade. These weren't grand bazaars with banners and bells. No, they were subtle. A sack of barley exchanged in the alley behind a scribe's house. a pot of beer sold beneath the eaves of a dark granary, a healing herb passed silently between two hands under a fig tree. The sellers weren't crooks or criminals. Many were just poor, a widow selling her last batch of oil, a shepherd needing thread before dawn, but need, however humble, still stood against the law, and the law was watching. The Pharaoh's enforcers, especially the feared eyes of the gate, roamed the streets. Long after most had gone to bed, these guards worked in pairs and carried not torches, but polished copper mirrors to reflect even the faintest glimmer of firelight in doorways or courtyards. They were trained not to announce themselves, but to observe, to note, and then to report. Those caught breaking curfew didn't always face public punishment. In fact, the most common discipline was quiet correction, a visit from a temple official the next morning, bearing a scroll and a choice: pay a fine, donate today's goods to the temple storerooms, or lose trading rights for a moon cycle. The pharaoh preferred order, not spectacle. Yet sometimes examples had to be made. One carved panel from a burial chamber in Thebes shows a trader kneeling before a judge, surrounded by overturned baskets of fish and figs. The inscription reads, "He sold under the moon and was made to fast under the sun." A punishment not of jail, but of exposure, days of labor with no shade. A reminder that disobedience invited not only law, but heat. And yet, the moonlight markets continued, quiet, fragile, often forgotten. Some say these small acts of disobedience were tolerated more than punished. After all, even pharaohs knew that a kingdom must breathe, and sometimes breath escapes after dark. Still, every merchant who lit a lamp past sunset knew they were walking a fine line, not just between light and dark, but between survival and silence. So the market slept most nights, but not all sometimes, in the stillness of ancient Egypt. The night itself became a marketplace secret, sacred, and watched by more than just the stars. In the dusty courtyards and sunlit alleys of ancient Egypt, cats did not sneak, they glided. They were not pets, but protectors, sacred beings who slinked between the worlds of gods and men. And unlike any other animal in the kingdom, they were protected not just by custom, but by law. The cat was more than a creature, it was a symbol, linked to the goddess Bastet, who guarded the home, women, and fertility. Cats were seen as divine messengers. When they purred, it was said to be a hum of balance between order and chaos. When they hunted rats and snakes, they were guardians of grain and life. For this, the pharaohs gave them the full weight of legal sanctuary. To harm a cat accidentally or on purpose was considered a crime against the gods themselves. Legal scrolls from the late period around 600 BCE mention edicts that forbade the killing, injuring, or sale of cats beyond the Nile. Exporting them was seen as treasonous. Special envoys were even sent to foreign lands like Persia and Cyprus to retrieve stolen felines. But the most striking law was this: if a person was found guilty of killing a cat, the punishment was death. No exceptions, not class, not age, not intent. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE, wrote in awe of this law. He tells the story of a Roman soldier who accidentally killed a cat while backing his chariot. Despite his rank, his wealth, and desperate pleas from the Roman embassy, the Egyptian crowd pulled him from his home and beat him to death before the authorities could even respond. The law had spoken and the people enforced it with religious fury, but it wasn't always violent. In most towns, cat-related cases were handled with care. A scribe would record the cat's death. Witnesses would be called. If guilt was proven, the punishment was swift. If not, the case was closed in silence. Cats themselves were often buried with the same respect as people. Tiny tombs, linen wrappings, incense rituals. In the city of Bubastis, entire cemeteries were dedicated to feline mummies, wrapped delicately with gold thread collars and perfumed resins. People left offerings at their graves, fish bones, carved amulets, and handwritten prayers in this land of pyramids and papyrus. Where laws were many and justice slow, the cat stood above it, all a living law, a sacred citizen, and a soft-footed judge in its own right. No creature, not even man, moved through the streets of Egypt with more protection than the purring guardian of Bastet. When a cat died under unnatural or suspicious circumstances in ancient Egypt, it wasn't just grief that followed, it was investigation, ritual, and sometimes rage. While the Pharaoh's law firmly punished those who harmed sacred cats, the people's devotion often went further beyond courts, beyond officials, into the realm of mob justice. In the tightly packed streets of Memphis, or the temple alleys of Bubastis, news of a cat's death spread fast. Whispers turned into warnings. Doors closed. People gathered. If someone was suspected even before a trial, they could be taken by the crowd. Diodorus Siculus recorded several incidents where locals, without waiting for priests or magistrates, would surround the home of the accused. Stones were thrown. Roofs were torn. In one chilling account, a merchant accused of poisoning a neighborhood cat was dragged into the square by candlelight and left to the will of the townsfolk. By morning, only silence remained. This wasn't lawlessness. In the minds of those who acted, it was justice for bet. To kill a cat wasn't just to break a rule, it was to offend the balance of the cosmos. Just as the Nile must rise and the sun must return, cats must be protected. To fail them was to invite divine disfavor on an entire household or even a city. In more orderly cases, priests were called in to examine the cat's body. Just like human coroners, they looked for signs of trauma, poison, or mishandling. If foul play was found, the accused was summoned to the temple court. These trials were held not in public squares, but within the sacred halls, where incense clouded the air and statues of Bastet watched from the shadows. There, the punishment was delivered in hushed tones: banishment, fines, or execution. Sometimes, the guilty were required to donate a shrine, sponsor a festival, or pay for the mummification of dozens of cats as penance. But the greatest fear wasn't the law, it was the curse. Many believed that harming a cat would bring sickness, crop failure, or the death of one's firstborn. This fear was not just religious, it was deeply personal. Families would place protective charms above their doorways, hang images of Bastet with wide eyes and and teach their children that even touching a cat's whiskers without need was a sign of disrespect. So in a land where crocodiles were feared and lions respected, it was the house cat's maw, silent and sacred, that held the deepest protection, and to cross it was to cross a line that even pharaohs dared not step over. In the quiet villages along the Nile, where huts stood shoulder to shoulder under a baking sun, the smell of smoke once marked both life and danger. Cooking fires were everywhere, small, crackling, tucked into courtyards where children played, and elders told stories. But as darkness approached, the law took over. By the third hour, after midday, what we would call early afternoon, strict rule came into effect. No new cooking fires could be lit, and those already burning had to be extinguished before night fell. This was not a suggestion. It was the fire ban, enforced under Pharaoh's decree to protect homes, crops, and sacred structures from devastating nighttime blazes. Most Egyptian homes were made from sun-dried mud bricks, strong enough for the desert, but weak against flame. Thatched roofs, woven red mats, and animal fat used for cooking made every neighborhood a quiet tinderbox. A single ember, caught by wind, could destroy half a village. The fire ban wasn't just about safety, it was about control. Each district had a fire warden, a local appointed by temple or palace to walk the lanes and sniff the air. These wardens were trained to recognize the difference between incense and soup, between fire for worship and fire for stew. If someone was caught cooking after the third hour, they could face fines, confiscation of goods, or even public penance in the temple courtyard. To help citizens obey, a simple signal was used, a low drumbeat from the village temple. 3 slow booms echoed out across the fields and walls. That meant it was time to douse the flames, cover the coals, and let the heat fade with the sun. Some families tried to stretch the law-burying hot stones under food jars to keep stews warm or moving their cooking pots to rooftops where smoke could blend with the open sky. Others bribed fire wardens with bread or oil. But if their trickery led to fire damage, there was little mercy. Pharaoh's law demanded collective punishment. If your pot caused a blaze, your neighbors would suffer too. Despite the fear, many villagers found peace in the law. With fire-banned evenings became a time of cool breezes and candlelight, when the dangers of the day faded into soft shadows. Elders told stories by oil lamps, and children learned to fall asleep under the stars, their stomachs full, their homes safe from flame. It was a world shaped not just by what you could do, but by when you had to stop. As the sun dipped behind the dunes and shadows stretched long across the village walls, dinner in ancient Egypt was served not hot, not fresh from flame, but quietly cold. This wasn't because of poverty or laziness. It was because the law made it so. After the third-hour fire ban took effect, no one could rekindle a flame, and so every household adapted. Mothers rose early to cook the day's meals in full. Pot-baked lentils, stewed onions, dates in honey, and coarse barley bread were prepared and left to rest in woven baskets or cool earthen jars. Evening meals became a ritual of reheated stones and patient hands, not burning wood and open flame. This cold supper was called heket nefru by some, the peaceful portion. It was a time of silence, when people chewed slowly and let the noise of the day dissolve into the hush of dusk. For the wealthy, this was no hardship. They had stone kitchens built into thick-walled estates that held heat for hours. Their servants used thermal jars, pottery, double-lined with insulating reeds, to keep food warm without a spark. These vessels were marked with official seals, proof that no fire had touched them after curfew. But for the common folk, especially those who labored in the fields or lived along the reed-choked canals, warm dinners were rare. Their food cooled quickly, their stew jars covered with cloth to keep the flies out. Children learned early that the crackle of a flame after sunset was a sound to fear, not welcome. And yet, in that stillness, something gentle bloomed. Families gathered closer. Meals were slow and mindful, without the noise of fire or the rush of heat. People listened to frogs in the canal, to the rustling palms, to the stories whispered between mouthfuls. Cold food became part of the rhythm of life, and to eat it without complaint was seen as a form of respect for the Pharaoh's peace. Temples taught that this curfew was more than practical, it was sacred. Night was the domain of Ra's journey through the underworld. Fire after sunset risked confusing spirits, drawing unwanted attention from beings best left alone. Even lamps were limited. Oil was rationed, and too much light was seen as an invitation for mischief. Breaking the law didn't just risk punishment, it risked being seen by neighbors, by spirits, by watchful priests who wandered at dusk, listening for the forbidden crackle. And so, Egypt's villages embraced the chill. Warmth came not from flame, but from company, from story, from the quiet trust that morning would bring the fire again. You might imagine a farmer in ancient Egypt picking up his tools one day and deciding to visit the next village to see his cousin or sell his onions at a new market. But it wasn't that simple. Even in the days of sand and stone, you couldn't just walk out of town not without a travel scroll stamped with the seal of local authority. In Pharaonic Egypt, villages, temples, estatesal were part of a tightly woven system where movement was tracked, recorded, and approved. If you wanted to leave your village for any reason, work, worship, or even marriage, you needed what they called a nesuta, a formal permit bearing the name of your town, your trade, your father's lineage, and the reason for your journey. Without it, you were not just a traveler. You were a suspicious figure, possible thief, deserter, or blasphemer. These permits were often made of papyrus and carried by hand or worn in a leather pouch tied around the chest. Some were marked with ink that faded in sunlight, requiring renewal every few weeks. Others bore tiny clay seals pressed with the insignia of the local scribe or overseer, making forgery incredibly difficult. Even priests weren't exempt. Temple scribes needed permission from the high priest to journey to sacred sites like Abydos or Heliopolis. The logic was clear. If someone was caught far from home, the state needed to know why. Travel checkpoints existed at city gates, ferry crossings, and desert paths. Watchmen, often retired soldiers, sat under shade canopies and demanded to see documents. Those without them were turned back or worse. Some were jailed. Others were conscripted into hard labor for wandering without purpose. In border regions, near Nubia or the Sinai, unauthorized movement was treated as espionage. There were exceptions, of course. Nobles moved freely, but the ordinary person, their world was small and carefully fenced with ink and law. Yet despite the restrictions, keep his travel scroll long after the trip, folding it into a shrine or tucking it behind a home idol. For some, it was the only proof that they had once gone farther than the river bend. So when you think of the ancient world as wide and open, remember, the roads were there, but not everyone had the right to walk them. It was late afternoon in a dusty village near the Nile, and the sun hung like a golden plate above the mud brick rooftops. A boy, barely 16, decided to follow the canal toward the next settlement. He had no scroll, no stamped papyrus, just sandals, a bundle of dried dates, and a curious mind. By nightfall, he was in shackles. To travel without written permission in ancient Egypt wasn't just foolish, it was illegal. And worse, it suggested you were hiding something: stolen goods, criminal intent, or heretical thoughts. Pharaoh's kingdom was built on order, and movement was part of that sacred rhythm. Those who wandered without a writ were called wayfarers of the wind, a poetic name for what officials considered lawbreakers. They were stopped at ferry crossings, questioned at temple steps, or brought before village courts to explain their presence. If their reasons were weak or their story changed, they faced punishment. Sometimes it was simple, a public scolding, fines, or lashes. Other times, it meant being drafted into state labor, sent to help with irrigation, canals, or pyramid upkeep. For repeat offenders, exile or imprisonment in desert fortresses awaited. The fear of being caught led many to take dangerous back routes, walking through reeds, avoiding checkpoints, sleeping under stars instead of temple inns. But that too was risky. Patrols moved along the Nile with boats and dogs. Desert trails had informants, often locals paid in grain or silver, to report unmarked strangers. There are scrolls from the Middle Kingdom that describe entire identity. Raids, sudden sweeps through towns, where scribes checked papers at markets and workshops. Those without documentation were removed, questioned, sometimes branded. In such a tightly controlled world, a man without a scroll was a ghost, invisible in the law, uncounted in the census, unblessed by Pharaoh's favor. And yet, some still wandered, out of need, out of defiance, out of longing. A young woman whose father died might walk to a cousin's farm without papers, hoping for mercy. A potter with no work might try his luck in another town, risking arrest for a better future. Their steps were soft, but their decisions were brave. Even today, archaeologists have found hidden papyrus scrolls buried near old roads and border shrines, evidence that travel was both sacred and dangerous, marked by prayer, secrecy, and ink. So, next time you dream of walking ancient paths under starlight, remember this: in Pharaoh's Egypt, freedom of movement was not a right, it was a regulated privilege. And a man caught walking too far could lose more than just his way. When someone died in ancient Egypt, the mourning did not end with the weeping. It began a new duty for the living. Long before modern taxes on inheritance or estate, there existed the tomb tax, a quiet, obligatory payment that tied the community to the dead. Death was not a private affair. It was a public burden, and Pharaoh's kingdom demanded its share. Villagers, artisans, and farmers were all expected to contribute toward the construction and upkeep of tombs, especially those of nobles and royal officials. The logic was sacred. If the dead were not honored properly, their spirits would rise restless, angry, and cursed. A poorly built tomb was not just disrespected, was dangerous. So each year, just after the flooding season, when the fields were wet and rest was possible, collectors came with scrolls and soft voices. They asked not just for grain or silver, but for mud bricks, bundles of linen, or help-shaping stones. Even those who could not pay in goods were required to lend time to, or 3 days of labor chiseling names into walls or polishing statues of the dead. For the poorest, this wasn't easy. A woman with 5 children might still be asked to send her eldest to carry tools to the necropolis. A weaver with stiff fingers might have to cut linen for burial wrappings, unpaid and unthanked. Yet few refused, because the fear of spiritual disorder, dead man, forgotten. A ghost turned sour was more terrifying than lost time. Some tombs even had public contribution walls, sections carved not with prayers, but with names of villagers who helped build them. Bakari, son of Seti, carried 12 bricks. Nima, spinner of the East Road, gave 2 bolts of linen. It was their quiet way of buying peace in life and the afterlife. And there were exceptions. If a person had served Pharaoh well, or died defending a temple, the crown might cover the costs entirely. But for most, death came with a receipting. You either paid it with grain or with sweat. Over time, the tomb tax shaped how people viewed their place in the world. To be part of a burial was to be part of something eternal. Even if you lived in a crumbling hut, your name might rest in stone beneath the sand, wrapped in shadow beside the honored dead. And so, death in Egypt was more than an ending. It was a quiet contract between the living and the departed, a shared responsibility to honor what must fade and preserve what must be remembered. The pyramids rise in silence, now solemn and unmoving beneath the desert sky. But when they were new, they buzzed with effort, with soft commands and clinking chisels. These were not built by slaves dragged under whips, as many once imagined. They were built, in part, by taxes, quiet, dusty taxes. To understand how a civilization managed to raise such colossal tombs, one must first understand how Egypt measured loyalty, not just in worship, but in labor. Every able-bodied person was expected to contribute. They did not call it taxation in the way we do now, but if you grew wheat, you owed a portion. If you made beer, a part of it flowed toward the Pharaoh's building fund. And if your trade was stone or copper or cart-pulling, your hands belonged to the tomb for a time. Twice a year, when the Nile flooded and fields were unreachable, the Pharaoh's officials summoned workers from towns and villages. These were not soldiers. They were potters, cooks, brewers, carpenters, bakers, ordinary people, rotating in and out of the pyramid camps like clockwork. Historians now call this system corvée, labor-forced civic duty, but to the Egyptians it was part of the sacred rhythm of life and death, and in exchange the workers received rations, bread, onions, and jars of beer. Some were granted clothing, amulets, or a small wedge of land after their service. Those who worked the longest often had their names inscribed in the workers' villages or the graffiti tucked behind the great stones, proof that they too touched eternity. Pharaohs, of course, funded much of the work with their vast royal stores, but even those stores were filled by taxes, gifts, tithes, and levies from temples, farmers, and craftsmen. Even a tiny crack in a pottery jar, if spotted during an inspection, could lead to a fine. That fine, it helped fund the next phase of the tomb. The cost was spiritual, too. Families who could afford it would donate to the royal burial in hopes their own dead might receive blessings in return. Some stitched cloth for mummies. Others carved small figurines, to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. And so, the pyramid rose not by one hand, but by thousands. Not with gold, but with grain and sweat, slowly bartered from life's daily rhythm. Each stone rested on the backs of those who gave their time, their labor, and often their names to the desert. Wind. What remains today is not just stone but memory, a nation's quiet promise that no king would face the afterlife alone. The market opened with the hush of dawn-cool air whispering through stalls, the scent of clay mingling with dates and dust. Pottery stood in neat rows, lined like soldiers, jars, bowls, amphorae, all handmade with care. But these were not just vessels for oil or grain. They were subject to law. In ancient Egypt, the quality of pottery was more than a matter of pride. It was a matter of legality. If a pot had a hairline crack, a chipped lip, or even an uneven glaze, could not be sold. This wasn't superstition, it was law, and it was enforced with the slow, patient eyes of the Pharaoh's market inspectors. These inspectors would wander from stall to stall in marketplaces like those in Memphis or Thebes, dressed in simple linen but carrying the power of royal decree. They tapped pots gently with sticks, listening for the wrong echo. They examined each curve for evenness, and if a pot failed, the seller could be fined, the piece confiscated, or worse, marked as deceitful. Egypt's entire food system relied on jars. Grains were stored in them. Beer was brewed in them. Oils, perfumes, medicines, everything sacred and ordinary sat inside baked clay. A bad pot didn't just mean a broken jar. It meant spoiled food, sickness, waste, and so the Pharaoh's government treated broken pottery like a danger to public health. Artisans knew this. Most stamped their work with identifying seals or marks, something like a modern-day signature. These weren't for fame but for responsibility. If a cracked vessel was found in use, the mark could lead inspectors back to its maker, and the penalty would follow. Some potters tried to hide flaws by rubbing clay over chips or painting decorative bands to distract the eye. But these deceptions rarely lasted long under the desert sun. When caught, the punishment wasn't jail, it was often economic. A fine, a ban from market access, or, in some cases, public shaming before the guild. For the average Egyptian buyer, this law brought quiet reassurance. You could trust that the jar you carried home would hold your grain through the flooding season. You could trust that the pot holding your beer wouldn't crumble before the harvest. Trust enforced not by kindness but by careful inspection and dusty scrolls. And so, even something as small as a kitchen bowl was touched by law. It might seem strange now that ancient rulers would care about pottery. Crack could echo through an entire village. The stall was quiet before noon. Under a faded reed awning, rows of polished clay gleamed in the sun, but hidden behind their graceful curves lay something just as crafted as the pots themselves. Records, scrolls, seals, a soft bureaucratic rhythm beneath the marketplace hum. Selling pottery in ancient Egypt wasn't as simple as shaping clay and hoping for coins. Pot sellers were expected to keep written logs of what they made, where it went, and who bought it. In a society where goods traveled far from delta villages to Nubian outposts, this was how Pharaoh's reach extended beyond the Nile, through careful note-taking. Each pot, once fired and finished, was often stamped with a maker's seal. Sometimes it was a symbol, a fish, a bird, a sun disk. Other times it was a few hieratic characters that formed the name of the workshop or artisan. These marks weren't ornamental, they were a contract. If a pot cracked and someone reported it, the mark could trace it back to its origin, like a signature on a scroll. Larger workshops, those who supplied temples or granaries, hired scribes to maintain daily logs. They recorded how many pots were made, what materials were used, and where each batch was delivered. These scrolls were then stored in dusty shelves near kilns or handed to overseers who filed them in regional archives. Some fragments of these records survive, even now faded ink on papyrus, listing numbers like quiet echoes from 3,000 years ago. In smaller villages, where a single potter worked alone or with family, the documentation was simpler. They might carve a date on the base, or paint a streak in a certain color only their clan used. Still, when they brought their wares to market, inspectors asked, "Where is this pot from? Who made it?" And if the answer wasn't ready, the pot didn't sell. The real fear wasn't just rejection, it was association. If your pot was sold beside a broken one, and that broken one caused illness, a bad harvest, or spoiled beer, could affect your name. Word spread in whispers that pot was from the cracked kiln near the marshes. And so, artisans became quiet record keepers, preserving not only their pots, but their honor. These rules may feel distant now, softened by time, but the care remains familiar. Barcodes on modern packaging, expiration stamps, product numbers. The ancient world, too, wanted to trace a mistake to its maker, not out of cruelty, but to preserve peace in the smallest details of life. Because even in the land of golden gods and towering temples, a chipped bowl could ripple like the Nile. In ancient Egypt, writing wasn't just a tool, It was a sacred privilege. Like a flame carefully guarded in the dark, the skill to draw language from ink and read was given only to a chosen few, the scribes. These men, trained from childhood, were bound not just by literacy, but by law, for the written word was power, and Pharaoh did not share it lightly. Across the Nile's gentle shores, boys of noble birth sat in cool, stone classrooms, while outside, other children learned to shape mud bricks or harvest wheat. Within the temple walls, young scribes learned to control a reed brush as steady as a soldier's spear, scrolls, and endless repetition. But this sacred learning came with boundaries. It was illegal for commoners to be taught to write. Not just discouraged, punishable. In many districts, it was said that only those ordained by the priesthood or appointed by the state even recite old stories, but they could never record them. The law was clear. The word, when written, belongs to Pharaoh. This exclusivity protected more than hierarchy. It protected the illusion of magic. Tax office, tell them my ox has died, and the scribe, dipping his brush in soot and water. It was forbidden to own blank papyrus unless one had a license, and even then, writing anything of state without approval could bring imprisonment. In certain periods, false scribes were tried for pretending the sacred gift and punished as deceivers of the divine. And yet, within these restrictions, a kind of quiet order thrived. Grain was counted, soldiers paid, letters were delivered. Across deserts, the temple walls were covered in prayers, records, stars, and dreams, and the Pharaoh god on earth made sure that memory remained in loyal hands. Today, as our fingers glide over glowing screens, it's easy to forget that once writing was a secret, and in the hush of that control, Egypt built an empire of ink. In ancient Egypt, writing was not a right, it was a royal gift, and the Pharaoh could choose who held the reed and who did not. To write was to wield a subtle kind of magic, and like all magic in Egypt, it was tightly controlled. Those who earned the title of scribe were more than just writers. The state relied on them to draft tax records, command military orders, manage temple accounts, and even compose hymns to the gods. In effect, the Pharaoh's rule was enforced not just by sword or chariot, but by scroll and signature. But this honor came with sharp boundaries. Only males from elite or temple families could enter the house of instruction. Commoners, women, and even some noble sons were denied entry. Exile, or worse, even among the scribes, access was tiered and monitored. Some were trained only in numbers, others in ritual text, and a rare few in royal decrees. Laws often dictated who could copy which kind of document. A scribe assigned to grain records might never be allowed to see a military scroll. A temple scribe writing hymns to Osiris would not be trusted with palace secrets. Scrolls were locked in chests, and those chests and rooms only the high scribe could enter. It was also illegal to teach writing without permission. A rogue teacher caught passing down hieroglyphs to a non-licensed student could be stripped of rank, beaten, or even forbidden from writing again. The law referred to this as misuse of divine ink. In a culture where words were believed to shape the afterlife itself, careless or unsanctioned writing was not merely sloppy, it was dangerous. In this rigid structure, writing remained rare, and that rarity was its power. Each law, each myth, each offering tally carved into stone held more than information. It held a claim to truth. A scribe's feathered brush, dipped in carbon black ink, could seal a marriage, settle a land dispute, or summon a god's name into permanence, but only if Pharaoh allowed it. In today's world, where writing is fast and free, it's easy to forget that once the right to write was power itself, and the Pharaoh, ever watchful, never let go of the ink. The Nile rose like a heartbeat, steady and sacred, and when its waters receded, they left behind a gift, dark, silken silt that could grow anything under the sun. But in the days of the Pharaohs, farmers didn't just plant by instinct or season, they planted by decree, the crops dictated not by nature, but by the palace. The Pharaoh's scribes, holding calendars carved with lunar symbols and star alignments, issued strict farming schedules each year. These were not mere suggestions. They were enforceable laws, tied to the rhythms of temples, taxes, and offerings to the gods. Crop rotation wasn't just smart agriculture, it was state policy. Each village received an annual farming mandate, often delivered by a priest scribe riding atop a donkey cart filled with scrolls. He would unroll a reed paper decree and read it aloud. This season, barley shall be sown upon the western banks, wheat upon the east. Villagers gathered in quiet obedience, memorizing the commands like scripture. The logic was both practical and divine. Wheat and barley, when rotated correctly, enriched the soil and prevented overuse, knowledge passed down through centuries of observation. But Pharaoh claimed it as his wisdom, gifted by the gods. To ignore the decree was to defy divine order. Inspections followed the flood. Regional officials would walk the damp fields, measuring plots and asking questions. If a farmer was found to have disobeyed, planting the same crop in the same plot as last year, he could be fined, lose his grain quota, or be whipped publicly. As an example, temples too played a role. Certain fields near sacred grounds could only grow papyrus or lotus, used for scrolls and ritual oils. These lands were patrolled carefully, and stealing their harvest was tantamount to theft from the gods. Even accidental harvesting of the wrong row could lead to days in prison. The calendar itself was a marvel, divided into 3 seasons: Akit inundation, Pere growth, and Shemu harvest. It was updated with astronomical calculations by temple astronomers. Their observations determined when the king's decree would arrive, like a divine rhythm whispered from the stars. For the average farmer, the decree meant 2 things: predictability and pressure. Knowing what to plant brought order, but breaking the rule could cost your family its grain or your son his apprenticeship. Fields became silent contracts between man and monarch. And so, under the hot Egyptian sun, rows of crops shimmered like soldiers standing in perfect formation, not just for the harvest, but for the Pharaoh's will. To disobey the Pharaoh's farming order wasn't just careless, it was criminal. In the Nile Delta, even the soil had to show respect. When a farmer dared to ignore the royal decree and planted crops out of turn, it didn't go unnoticed. For long land inspectors, often former scribes or soldiers turned bureaucrats, traveled from village to village with a staff, a tally scroll, and a trained eye. They knew what to look for. Barley had a different scent, wheat bent with a different curve, and the texture of the soil betrayed secrets. If a field told the wrong story, the consequences began quietly, like the whisper of sand. A fine was the lightest punishment. This wasn't a coin slipped from palm to palm, but a portion of grain seized at harvest, sometimes up to 1/3 of the season's yield. For subsistence farmers, this was devastating. Children went without sandals, and storerooms echoed emptier through the dry season. If defiance became repeat offense, especially in temple-owned lands or royal allotments, the punishment grew harsher. Public reprimands were common, where the farmer would stand under the scorching sun, while an overseer read aloud his crime before the village. Some were sentenced to dig irrigation ditches or haul bricks for the governor's estate. A reminder, they were told, of the order you broke. Yet, despite the harshness, many farmers still bent the rules. Why? Because Pharaoh's calendar didn't always match nature's mood. Some years, the barley struggled in newly assigned plots, while millet might have flourished instead. But logic was powerless in the face of law to dodge the law. Some farmers falsified their plot markers, moving stone boundary lines under cover of darkness. Others planted forbidden crops in outer corners of their fields, praying the inspectors wouldn't notice. If caught, these small rebellions were met with double fines and, in rare cases, banishment from temple-supported villages. In more elite estates, farming compliance was stricter, especially where the harvest fed armies or supplied palace festivals. Overseers walked fields with wooden measurement boards, ensuring every cubit of land matched its assigned crop. Deviations were marked with red ink, a symbol of shame and penalty. Yet many farmers still spoke with quiet reverence of the calendar. Despite its weight, it gave structure, a shared rhythm passed from sun to soil. They saw the pharaoh not only as a ruler, but a guardian of the seasons, someone who organized the unpredictable world into something reliable. So year after year, despite punishments, fines, and silent frustrations, the people obeyed the rhythm, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and bowing to the eternal law of the land. The ancient Egyptians cherished beer. It was not merely a drink, it was food, medicine, currency, and comfort. Made from fermented loaves of bread and flavored with herbs or date syrup, this thick, frothy beverage was found at every level of society. From workers to nobles, beer was daily life. But even in a land soaked in barley and celebration, the Pharaoh's scribes drew clear lines. There was a legal limit to how much beer a person could drink, especially if they served in sacred spaces. A set of temple laws carved in the reign of Amenhotep III reveals strict beer rations for priests. A scribe might receive only 2 vessels per day, while singers and dancers in the temple were allotted just 1 before dusk. The reasoning was divine. One must be clear-minded when honoring the gods. Let no priest be found staggering, lest the altar be dishonored, said one edict, preserved in the House of Life archives at Edfu. If a temple guardian was found drunk, his punishment was poetic and symbolic. He would be made to sit outside the sanctuary for a full lunar cycle, facing the walls he once entered, watching, sober and silent, even among commoners. Festival laws existed to regulate overindulgence. During the festival of Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, and often intoxication, it was permitted, even encouraged, to drink heavily. But outside those days, beer intoxication in public could lead to fines or temporary detainment. One village record from near Memphis tells of a potter who drank beyond his ration and sang loudly in the market square, mocking officials. The punishment: 3 days of cleaning the temple latrines and chanting hymns while sober. His name was noted, his laughter remembered, but the lesson lingered. By also served a political purpose. Rations were used as rewards or restrictions. Workers who performed well might receive a 4th portion, while those who spoke out or slowed production would see their beer halved. To remove someone's beer was to remove comfort, identity, even hope. The Pharaoh's limit on lager wasn't about cruelty. It was about preserving calm, order, and sacred rhythm. In a land where life was unpredictable, floods, sandstorms, harvests, and omens, the Pharaoh's laws anchored the people to something steady, something known. Even joy, they believed, must be measured. Even laughter should be timely. And so, while the golden brew flowed from pots to lips, it did so with the weight of ancient law, sweet, warm, and watched. By moonlight or midday, the scent of barley beer clung to the air like incense. It drifted from taverns tucked in alleyways and from temple courtyards where silent priests walked in linen robes. Yet, the land of the Pharaoh was no place for reckless revelry. Beer may have been sacred, but drunkenness was taboo, especially where gods were watching. Temples had their own strict rhythms. Each prayer, ritual, and offering was timed to the stars and to the Nile's breath. The priests who served these altars were bound not only by faith, but by law. Let the mind remain as still as the statue of Osiris. One rule read carved in stone outside a Theban shrine. That stillness meant sobriety. No wine, no beer, no mead before ritual duties. Not even a sip. Before dawn, a priest would bathe, purify his body, change into fresh robes, and walk into the sanctuary completely clear-headed. His breath could not carry the scent of drink. His steps could not sway. If a priest was caught disobeying this law, he would not only be removed from temple service, but his name could be scratched from the temple scrolls, a symbolic erasure. From memory itself, outside temple walls, taverns thrived. These were often run by women, independent, business-savvy, and occasionally influential. The most famous was Henu's House of Cups, mentioned in a court scroll during the 19th dynasty. It served honey beer, strong date wine, and bitter barley ale, but taverns were monitored. Scribes kept rough ledgers. Guards patrolled districts. During feast nights, selling drink to priests on duty was illegal. If a tavern did so, it could lose its right to operate during high festivals, the most profitable days of the year. Children under 13 were not allowed in taverns after sundown, and no beer was to be served in containers that weren't marked with the maker's seal, a rule meant to prevent poisoning and bootleg mixing. Even during festivals, there were unspoken boundaries. While the feast of drunkenness celebrated Hathor and involved wild intoxication, the next day was one of mandatory fasting and silence. A balance had to be kept: pleasure followed by repentance, laughter followed by stillness. The Pharaoh's role in all of this was silent, yet firm. His likeness stood in every tavern, carved into wooden plaques or painted on mud walls, a reminder that he watched over all things, even the way joy was poured and swallowed. In the world of ancient Egypt, the line between sacred and sinful was thinner than a reed, and the sound of a clay cup tipping too loudly could mean more than embarrassment. It could mean exile from the very rituals that held the world in balance.